Inside the sub, you're relatively comfortable. Certainly there are things that can go wrong. If they do go wrong, it's not going to matter anyway, and it's going to happen so quickly that you're not going to even know it happened probably.
The ocean is scarier than space. We know more about space than we do about the ocean, and it's definitely not something we're ever going to be trying to do again.
How important is it for you to have a safe submarine?
Well, obviously I don't want to die and I don't want to kill anybody.
I think adventure is the right word. You know, you've been known to say an adventure is when things don't go as planned. And this is actually when there's usually an interesting outcome.
Ever since the RMS Titanic tragically sank to the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean in the early hours of the morning on April the 15th, 1912, claiming the lives of 1,517 people, it has captivated the entire world with its legacy as the biggest and most unsinkable ship at the time. A shipwreck that remained undiscovered for 73 years. But the mystery of the Titanic continued to live on and be discussed across the globe. But at some point, we have to question when this fascination becomes an obsession, and when it has to end. After that fateful April night in 1912, the actual whereabouts of the ship itself remained a mystery. This was most likely due to poor communication on the night, unclear eyewitness accounts, and incorrect coordinates relayed to others in regards to their location at the point of impact of the iceberg and subsequent sinking. Despite this, almost immediately after the sinking, wealthy family members of the victims actually took it upon themselves to attempt to dive down to retrieve the bodies of their loved ones and maybe even their belongings. However, this was scrapped due to the sheer depth of the wreckage, reaching over 6,000 pounds per square inch of water pressure. They just didn't have the technology to actually pull it off, and those who did were using it for the First World War instead. Another idea was even to throw dynamite down there to potentially dislodge victims' bodies and allow them to float successfully to the surface, but this also never went ahead. Another idea was to attach electromagnets to a submarine for it to be drawn to the ship's wreck, and then, using a fleet of barges, potentially bring the Titanic back up to the surface. However, this would have cost around $1.5 million, which is around $35.5 million today. Another idea was actually attaching balloons to the hull of the ship using electromagnets and then gently bringing it back up, but this also never came to fruition. Not only did it seem impractical and financially impossible to pull this off, but there generally wasn't a great deal of interest in the project either, finding it completely pointless. Furthermore, they weren't even sure of the condition of the wreckage, and it could potentially be a suicide mission. It wasn't until the 1970s when we were finally closing in. Michael Harris and Jack Grimm had developed a remotely controlled deep-sea vehicle they named Argo, along with a robot called Jason that would be attached so it could roam the sea floor to gather specimens and collect close-up images. These images would then immediately be transmitted to them in a control room. This was specifically designed for this mission, but it could also be used for military projects, leading to the actual Navy sponsoring it on the condition that they could use it for their own missions as well. They began searching the most likely area of the sinking before finally, after 73 years of mystery, on September the 1st, 1985, at 12:48 AM, a piece of debris began to appear on their screen which they quickly recognized as being a boiler from photos they had seen from 1911. It wasn't until the following day when they discovered the main wreck of the Titanic. It had finally been found.
To get to go down and see this legendary ship, and to go with Jim Cameron.
The Titanic is just such a huge draw. As I like to say, there are only three things the average person knows are in the ocean. That's whales, sharks, and the Titanic. It's the most known brand, the most known object, and there's just this huge desire to go to it.
I volunteered. When I heard what he was doing, I told him right off, like, you know, that was my once in a lifetime opportunity to go that deep in a sub.
Someone had read about Ocean Gate and said, this sounds right up your alley. And so we took some of their initial test dives off of New York City, off of in Hudson Canyon, off of Staten Island. We went 1,000 feet down with Stockton Rush and an earlier sub. And it was only when we came back, he said, you're the first people to do that. And I go, wow, I did not expect to be Neil Armstrong in the Hudson Canyon.
To get to go down and look at this famous ship and to really see it there and to go, my God, there it is.
When we got to the wreck, I think what I found the most surprising, it looks like it does in the movie Titanic. You get to the bow and there's that moment of awe when you're looking at the bow and saying, well, this is what I've seen so many times.
The shot everybody knows.
The shot everybody knows.
When I learned that he wanted to do this, I was very excited about it. I believed in his mission. I liked him as a friend, and I told him I want to go down in that thing one day, and what do I need to do? And I actually went out to his Everett facility and gave him a week of free labor, paid for my own airfare, hotel and everything, and just for the chance to get a seat on that sub, because I knew it was it's a very rare opportunity.
Many people appreciate there are only 4 manned submersibles that can get to the depth of the Titanic. In the past, travelers would go using the Russian Mir submersibles, which have been placed in storage for the last several years. So it's very rare. More people have been to space than have been to even the depth of the Titanic.
Water's so deep, it's never seen the sun.
The Titanic wreck site is a very hostile place. It's a dangerous site to dive. If you think of a typical research dive, you go down and you're really just operating over a bottom. You may be looking for organisms, you may be looking at geology. Hydrothermal vent sites can be a bit dangerous as well. But Titanic, you've got, this 8-story, 10-story high structure with overhanging metal structures. It's a twisted mess. You can get entangled.
I jumped at it. But then as you start thinking about physically what's going to be required of you to get in a 3-man deep-sea Russian submersible for a 13-hour dive, to go down 2.5 miles to a place where the sun has never penetrated. And you're starting to think, okay, I've got young kids, I need to get them to an age where they can support themselves before I do something this crazy.
This made worldwide news, and subsequent expeditions to the wreck continued for years, with items even being recovered, including by filmmaker James Cameron whilst preparing work on the feature film, who ended up visiting the wreck 33 times, actually spending more time inside the Titanic than the captain himself. In the first 100 years of the Titanic sinking, around 140 people visited the wreck, but these expeditions were all treated with the utmost care and precautions. But sadly, this wouldn't always be the case. Underwater tourism had actually become a thing back in 1986, when Atlantis Submarines provided submersible tours of the coral reefs near Grand Cayman Island, which gained a lot of interest in the industry in the years that followed. In 2003 alone, more than 2 million passengers collectively paid $150 million to go underwater in submersibles that were always in shallow depths. But all of these explorations truly inspired a man by the name of Stockton Rush. Stockton Rush always had a big interest in aviation and space travel as a child, even gaining a commercial pilot license at the age of 18. But as he entered adulthood, with the interest in underwater tourism forever growing, his passion soon spread to the ocean.
I really wanted to be a space explorer. And I realized a little late in life that every species to be discovered in our solar system is probably in the ocean. I founded Ocean Gate about 10 years ago when I discovered that you really can't go in a sub other than maybe a tourist sub in Hawaii. But going underwater beyond scuba diving depth is really something that's not accessible. And wanted to change that. Wanted to take people underwater to change how people relate to the ocean.
He was very young when I first met him, and he told me about his dream to develop a technology to dive on the Titanic.
Even if I gave you a 3D representation of the Grand Canyon and piped in the smell of sagegrass, it won't replace being there. Knowing that you're there and that being able to hear and see and feel the entire environment is something you can't duplicate. You can't do a digital representation of the Acropolis. You have to go to it.
If you don't really experience it, it's hard to appreciate the subsea environment just with videos, and look at opportunities to be able to make money. You taking people underwater, because that was one of the limitations.
Most scientists get involved in marine biology because they want to go in the ocean. They're interested in the ocean, and they start with scuba diving, and they don't have the opportunities. They get farther into it. The only resources they have are remote sensing vehicles, remotely operated vehicles, and I think most of them got in it because they have a passion for it. Every time I dive, I see something I've never seen before, that no human has probably ever seen before.
Stockton ended up receiving some inheritance, which he decided to invest in some technological companies in an attempt to buy his own submarine. However, this failed when he actually found out that there were less than 100 privately owned submarines in the entire world. However, this didn't deter him, as in 2006 he decided to build his own, a Kittredge K350 model named Suds. Stockton was convinced that he had a big business opportunity on his hands to open up a privately ran ocean exploration business. He believed that submersibles had an unwarranted reputation as being dangerous due to, in his words, rigid government regulations, and he felt he could actually capitalize on this to bring the interest back. There was now an increase in development for new deep diving submersibles, which in turn opens the door for new business ventures.
A manned sub is a magnet for both media, but it's also a great platform for researchers to be able to see the same environment that the lionfish is living in, discuss and hypothesize and test theories. We should have as many subs out there as we have land rovers. You're trying to explore something that's 100 times larger than Africa, and doing it with a grand total of 100 subs, research subs on planet Earth.
In 2009, Stockton Rush founded his own company named OceanGate, alongside Guillermo Somlin in Seattle, Washington. Their goal was to create a small fleet of 5-person commercial submersibles that could be leased out to any organization, or even to tour a group of individuals.
The whole intent was to create these worked subs, and in that way, as our tagline was in the early days, open the oceans for all of humanity.
The first submersible used by OceanGate was a 5-person vessel named Antipodes, and for 3 years it was rented out to researchers and used for transporting tourists for underwater excursions. It's estimated that these trips cost the guests somewhere between $7,500 to $40,000 per person depending on the trip, and around 130 dives were done with this sub. Stockton himself quickly realised that he actually knew very little about sea life, so when he was asked questions about the creatures underneath the surface, he couldn't answer them, leading to him bringing marine biologists along to work as expert guides on the tours, and the first trip was to Catalina Island off the coast of California. In 2011, Antipodes was then used to survey and map the wreckage of SS Governor, which sank in the Puget Sound back in 1921 and remains 250 feet below the surface. 2 years later, OceanGate began designing their own submersibles with unique designs. However, at this point, Guillermo actually left the company, claiming that they had transitioned from their initial phase of Stockton's specialty engineering.
I know from the time Stockton and I co-founded the company in August of 2009 until I left in January 2013, we operated as safely as possible, and we had a very safety conscious culture. I left in January 2013 because it was the right time in the development of the company for me to turn over the company to Stockton. Stockton was one of the most intelligent people I've ever met. He was a very diligent engineer. He was not a risk taker at all. In fact, I'd say he was risk averse. He was very good at risk management. And I think anybody who does exploration, whether it's space, oceans, high altitudes, they'll tell you the same thing. They are not risk takers. They're risk managers.
I really, really admire his vision. I admire his spirit of innovation. I admire that he was a risk taker in some ways. I do think there are still really important questions to ask, not today, but soon, about his calculations of risk and acceptable risk. And again, I don't think that's something for today, but I do think that he was an innovator. He was someone who was trying to create a new platform that could open up the depths of the ocean to more people. I think that is a commendable, noble aim.
Their first custom-built submersible was named Cyclops, though it would later be changed to Cyclops 1. The hull was going to originally be carbon fiber, but they instead ended up buying a 12-year-old vessel called Lula from a company in Azores and simply extracted that steel hull to use for Cyclops 1 instead, which began being used 2 years later. By 2016, OceanGate began developing Cyclops 2, receiving the first titanium components that December. By January, they then signed a contract with Spencer Composites to design and build the cylindrical carbon fiber hull. It wasn't until March the following year when Cyclops 2 was renamed to Titan, which Stockton Rush called an amazing engineering feat. Spencer Composites had the incredibly difficult task to design a submersible intended to withstand huge pressure with a factor of safety of 2.25 times its intended maximum depth, and they only had 6 weeks to complete the design. Furthermore, most of the OceanGate employees working on this were only recently graduated students, as Stockton wanted them to be younger and more inspirational and not ex-military submariners.
I wanted our team to be younger, to be inspirational, and I'm not going to inspire a 16-year-old to go pursue marine technology. But a 25-year-old, who's a sub-pilot or a platform operator or one of our techs can be inspirational. And so we've really tried to get very intelligent, motivated, younger individuals involved, because we're doing things that are completely new. We're taking approaches that are used largely in the aerospace industry, is related to safety and some of the preponderance of checklists, things we do for risk assessments and things like that are more aviation related than ocean related. And we can train people to do that. We can train someone to pilot the sub. We use a game controller, so anybody can drive the sub. And we also want our team to have a variety of different background. You know, you're going to go to the Titanic, you're going to be spending 8 days on a boat. You don't want every person to have the same experience of having been on a U.S. nuclear sub or worked for Atlanta submarines, and they all have the same background.
The Titan was 6.7 meters long, made out of carbon fiber and titanium, and weighed approximately 10,432 kilograms, or 23,000 pounds. It moved at about 5.6 kilometers per hour, and supposedly could contain enough oxygen for 5 people to last around 96 hours under the water. Once the crew were inside, the hatch would be closed and bolted, and could only be opened from the exterior. On board, there was no actual form of real navigation. They had communication with a support ship above who would send them text messages below with directions, which they would then maneuver themselves towards using a modified wireless Logitech game controller. On board was a real-time acoustic monitoring system, which would mean that the crew would be able to detect any buckling in the carbon fiber hull prior to any emergency or catastrophic failure. The game controller was often criticised, but it's actually quite common use in aerial vehicles or bomb disposal robots. Even the US Navy themselves used Xbox 360 controllers in order to control periscopes in Virginia-class submarines.
You steer the ship with a controller, with a joystick from a gaming system, a home gaming system.
Before we went, we had never seen the sub. We didn't know anything about it. There's very little information on the website. I didn't know at that point that you drive the thing with an Xbox game controller. I didn't know that the ballast was, used construction pipes. And then you get the tour, and Stockton Rush, the designer of the sub, the CEO, explains to you that all of this stuff, the lights and the handles and the propellers, these are off-the-shelf parts. Because, well, not only are they inexpensive, but they're tried and true. They're mass-produced.
There's special training just to learn how to get into an escape suit, in and out of that. It's a very tough thing to get into these kind of warm weather coveralls that will float you if, you have to bail from a ship or escape from a submarine. Beyond that, no real training.
The only briefing that I remember getting on the sub is about fire. Beyond that, there just isn't anything we could do. I mean, if a giant octopus wraps its tentacles around, what are you going to do? So
they tell you before you go on, they go, we've got food on board, we've got water on board, and we have a toilet. And you'll see it's 10 hours. It's a 10-hour trip, and you won't use any of them. And for 10 hours, I never thought about even taking a sip of water. And the toilet they have on board the sub has never been used.
I have to say there wasn't a lot of emergency preparedness.
OceanGate claimed to have had backup ballast systems in case they would ever need to return to the surface in an emergency. Balloon thrusters and sandbags that were held by hooks which would dissolve after a certain number of hours in salt water, which would allow them to float safely to the surface. And if this failed, the crew inside would then be able to release the ballast by either tilting the sub back and forth to dislodge it, or by using a pneumatic pump inside to loosen the weights manually.
Everyone's focused on the detail, and it makes them think, oh, this was a real rinky-dink operation. But that is one of the prime assets, I think, of the whole sub, is just how simple it was. I mean, they even let me steer and navigate around, which was an amazing experience. But it's that simple, you know, and you don't want it overly complicated. There was never a moment where I go, oh, there's a bunch of computers and machinery going here that I don't understand. The propulsion on it was literally just two propellers that looked like a fan you would put on your desktop on a hot day.
The mechanism that releases the weights for us to allow us to descend up was not operating. We had gone through a process of rolling the sub back and forth, and fortunately we were able to dislodge the weights.
There are a lot of ways to drop weights, for instance, on Titan and bring it back to the surface. There's 4 different systems on board to drop weights. There's a computer-controlled system that can vent water in or out of ballast chambers to help it rise up in the ocean. There is a manual valve in Titan to take air and add it to bladders on the outside of the sub to bring it up. And there's a hydraulic controlled system that can drop weights off the bottom. And in fact, the entire skid assembly on the bottom of Titan can be dropped using a hydraulic lever, which takes a huge amount of weight off the sub to bring it to the surface. Those sort of things were baked into the design of Titan to make it more safe. But there are other elements of its design that are more challenging.
The one scary element of the whole voyage is the idea that to go back up, they push a lever that releases these lead weights, and the weights fall off, and then you bob to the surface.
And so you have these trade-offs. You have an innovative novel design, but it comes with a lot of mysteries, in terms of how it's going to perform over time.
I just thought if something goes wrong with that lever, that switch, and doesn't release the lead weights, I don't know what else you can do. You're just stuck. You obviously can't get out of the sub and do it manually.
However, there were almost immediately safety concerns regarding the construction of the submersible. The carbon fiber cylinder where the crew would be situated should have had a wall thickness of 4.5 inches or 114 millimeters. However, it was actually 3.25 inches or 83 millimeters, leaving it more sustainable to fatal water pressure. The hull was made from titanium, but the composite cylinder from carbon fiber, a material that Stockton was heavily advised against using. He had visited DOER Marine President Liz Taylor, who specifically warned him against this very design idea.
Carbon fiber specifically has been shown to not be very happy when it's being immersed, first of all, and then being hollow on the inside or just one atmosphere on the inside, and then having the tremendous pressure of the ocean trying to push in on it, it's not the right material.
Water is not just pressing down, it's pressing from all sides.
One of the safety concerns I had before getting on was literally about the structural integrity of the submarine. Before we got on, I saw a video of Stockton explaining how the submarine worked with the remote and everything like that, and I saw a lot of red flags with it, and it was only meant for 5 people, and I just didn't think that it could survive, going that low into the ocean. So ultimately, I ended up warning my dad about it, and he ended up agreeing with me. And when we tried to ask Stockton questions, he kind of brushed it off a little bit. So it's kind of red flags from the start.
And I was very suspect of the technology that they were using. I wouldn't have gotten in that sub.
This is one of the really challenging things about a vehicle like this, is that there is almost nothing to benchmark it against. There is no other vehicle like Titan anywhere in the world. It is a one-off. And so evaluating risk for a craft like this is really difficult. We know that carbon fiber is extremely strong. It's what's used to build the Boeing Dreamliner or the Airbus A350. It is a miracle product in a lot of ways. It can be 10 times stronger than steel, but there are real questions about carbon fiber in terms of its fatigue. How does it perform at these kind of pressures and at this kind of a cold temperature after multiple cycles? It's something that's hard to evaluate, and so risk is a very difficult thing to evaluate when it comes to Titan.
I never believed in that technology of wound carbon fiber, wound filament cylindrical hull. I thought it was a horrible idea. I wish I'd spoken up, but I assumed somebody was smarter than me, because I'd never experimented with that technology, but it just sounded bad. We make pressure hulls out of contiguous material: steel, titanium, ceramic, acrylic. And so you can model it, you can do finite element analysis of it, and you understand the yield properties, you understand the number of cycles that it can take. But you can't do that with a composite material because it's two dissimilar materials, sort of bonded together.
If he had made it out of something other than carbon fiber, he would probably still be alive. Carbon fiber does have the best strength to weight ratio. However, we need to do a lot more research has to be done.
Every other sub that goes down to these depths has a titanium or steel alloy pressure sphere. Titan was built using carbon fiber. It's a miraculous material. It's what we build next generation airplanes out of, like the Dreamliner, the A350. And it can be 10 times stronger than steel, but it has to be engineered to really exacting specifications. And there are a lot of mysteries about how this material performs at incredible pressure and in terms of those pressure cycles and fatigue, and in terms of incredibly cold temperatures. And there just was no data here to measure against. So for me, it was like you couldn't even assess the risk.
It's completely inappropriate for a vessel that sees external pressure. Carbon fiber composites are used very, very successfully for internal pressure vessels, like let's say a scuba tank. And you can get 2 or 3 times multiple of what you could get out of steel or aluminum for that type of pressure bottle. But for something that's seeing external pressure, all of the advantages of composite materials go away and all the disadvantages come into play.
He said, all these little things like the lights and the controller and the thrusters, those can break and you'll be fine. The part we put all our attention and care into is the passenger compartment that contains the air, the carbon fiber cylinder. And that we worked with NASA, we worked with Boeing. That, he said, is buttoned down and solid. So I don't think the fact that some of these things are kind of MacGyvered together is necessarily an indication of a general sloppiness.
Carbon fiber is 3 times better on a strength to buoyancy basis than titanium. And underwater, that's what you care about. It's not strength to weight, it's strength to buoyancy. And yet no one had done that. I'd like to be remembered as an innovator. I think it was General MacArthur said, you're remembered for the rules you break. And I've broken some rules to make this. I think I've broken them with logic and good engineering behind me. The carbon fiber and titanium, there's a rule you don't do that. Well, I did.
It's a very novel design. It doesn't look like any other submersible that has gone down to Titanic before, and a lot of that has to do with how it's made. It's made of a carbon fiber hull as opposed to having a steel or a titanium hull, and because it's carbon fiber, it could be made much larger. So it's actually quite a large submarine, can hold 5 people as opposed to most of the subs that go down to Titanic can only hold 2 or 3. So it's actually quite spacious inside as these kind of subs go.
It is true that the stuff he did is not how people do it. I mean, nobody has used carbon fiber to make a submersible like this before. Nobody has built a submersible that holds 5 people. The others all hold 2 or maybe 3, but no one's done 5. He uses all kinds of new techniques, and he admits that he has critics. He says all these fuddy-duddies stuck in the 1950s way of doing things, they're crazy. How are you ever going to make progress unless you experiment? He was emphatic that his ways were better, that they represent an improvement, and that they were safe.
If you're not breaking things, you're not innovating. If you're operating within a known environment, as most submersible manufacturers do, they don't break things. Woods Hole does a lot of autonomous things. They have a whole wall of stuff they've broken. To me, the more stuff you've broken, the more innovative you've been. And this is a third scale model that we took to the chamber at the University of Washington and took it to destruction.
I honestly believe that the more information comes out, we're going to see that he did a shockingly small amount of testing.
I think it's fine to be an innovator. You know, the sub that you sat in, that we built and that I operated to the deepest place on the planet, was an experimental craft. I own it. It was not certified. It was an experimental craft. Just like, you know, the Mercury and Gemini and Apollo rockets were experimental craft. They weren't certified, but they weren't taking passengers either.
Our rule is we risk capital, we don't risk people. So if somebody comes to me and says, hey, here's a new idea for the sub, if the end result of that failing is that we cancel a mission or we lose a little money, that's fine. If somebody gets hurt, then we go and find out a different approach.
It was not a charlatan scenario. It was not a fly-by-night. It was a very sophisticated operation, and the people involved were extremely careful, very technical, and checked and double-checked and triple-checked everything. So it's important that people know that.
He had no business bringing that thing out into the middle of the North Atlantic. And I mean, I explained it to him from every angle I could think of doing it. I don't think it was my place to try to, physically interfere with him or anything. And at the end of the day, the people signed waivers.
When confronted with these safety issues, Stockton claimed that the Passenger Vessel Safety Act of 1993 needlessly prioritized passenger safety over commercial innovation. He was undeterred by all of the warnings and stated,
"Since 1974, there has not been a serious injury or fatality on an ABS certified passenger submersible. These are the safest vehicles on the planet."
In March 2018, the Marine Technology Society wrote a letter to Stockton expressing concerns with the design of Titan, urging him to get the submersible certified by a ship classification society. OceanGate had been marketing the Titan as if it had met or exceeded the safety standards of DNV, which was a complete lie. Now, this letter never actually got sent, but the chairman of the committee did personally meet up with Stockton Rush to raise his concerns of these safety precautions, and Stockton's response was that they would have to agree to disagree.
That to me is misrepresenting themselves to their paying clients. And I guess one of the lessons is caveat emptor. Really look carefully. If you're going to get into a sub, look carefully at the company that designed the sub, look at its certification and all those things.
I don't think he was totally honest with them exactly how much issues the submarine had, and that information was not really coagulated by all his former customers and whatnot, that they would have had access to that information.
You went in your own designed craft that's a submersible that was experimental and didn't go through the standard safety protocols, but correct. The difference is you were not taking passengers on board. Would you ever have taken passengers on board a submersible that had not gone through the standard maritime safety protocols?
No, not at all. I mean, my sub that I went to the Challenger Deep dove safely 3 times deeper than Titanic. We made multiple dives in that sub. That sub was a single seater, and it was only contemplated that myself and the engineer with whom I co-designed the vehicle would be the only pilots of that sub, and we worked on it for 7 years. We knew every detail of it intimately. I was involved in every phase of the testing, so I assessed the risks. I understood them very well, and those were risks I was willing to take. I would never take it upon myself to ask someone else to take that type of risk.
So when these guys are like, well, you got to be certified, that's great if you can pull off a financial arrangement like that. That's not the majority of the world.
The arrogance and the hubris that sent that ship to its doom is exactly the same thing that sent those people in that sub to their fate. And I just think it's heartbreaking. I think it's heartbreaking that it was so preventable. OceanGate shouldn't have been doing what it was doing. I think that's pretty clear. I wish I had been more vocal about that, but I think I was unaware that they weren't certified.
They didn't have any external bodies, governmental or otherwise, overseeing what they're doing.
A lot of them got together and wrote a letter to OceanGate and said, you have to certify. You cannot take people down. It's irresponsible, and it could lead to catastrophe.
Rob McCallum was another who had previously worked with OceanGate, but he left the project as he felt it was all being rushed into development far too quickly. He even sent an email to Stockton stating,
"You are wanting to use a prototype, unclassed technology in a very hostile place. As much as I appreciate entrepreneurship and innovation, you are potentially putting an entire industry at risk."
To which Stockton replied,
"I know that our engineering-focused, innovative approach as opposed to an existing standards compliance-focused design process flies in the face of the submersible orthodoxy, but that is the nature of innovation. I have grown tired of industry players who try to use a safety argument to stop innovation and new entrants from entering their small existing market. Since Guillermo and I started OceanGate, we have heard the baseless cries of 'you are going to kill someone' way too often. I take this as a serious personal insult."
McCallum once again responded,
"I think you are potentially placing yourself and your clients in a dangerous dynamic. Ironically, in your race to Titanic, you are mirroring that famous catch cry, 'She is unsinkable.' Having dived the Titanic and having stood in a coroner's court as a technical expert, it would be remiss of me not to bring this to your attention."
He took it as a personal insult, a personal threat. No one should ever take safety as a personal threat.
But this still didn't deter Stockton Rush from following his dream.
The vast majority of marine and aviation accidents are a result of operator error, not mechanical failure. The classification focused solely on the physical state of the vessel and not its corporate actions, which are characterized as a constant, committed effort and a focused corporate culture of maintaining high-level operational safety.
In January 2018, OceanGate Director of Marine Operations David Lockridge actually filed a quality control report, advising that no non-destructive testing of the carbon fiber hull had actually taken place to check for damages or any signs of delamination, which could potentially compromise the strength of the hull. However, this was dismissed, and he was advised that the crew would rely solely on the real-time acoustic monitoring system on board. But Lockridge felt like this wouldn't adequately warn the crew of any potential failure, or if it did, it would only give them milliseconds to realise, react, reascend, abort and evacuate.
You know, this OceanGate sub had sensors on the inside of the hull to give them a warning when it was starting to crack. And I think if that's your idea of safety, then you're doing it wrong. You don't, and they probably had warning that their hull was starting to delaminate.
With composites, what you really want is acoustic monitoring. Strain gauges don't tell you a lot because they just tell you the deformation on the inner surface. When you're dealing with composites, acoustics will pop and crackle, and it's almost like having an EKG. You can tell how the hull is doing, and if we were going to stretch this new material in a new environment with people inside, we needed to know well before it failed that it failed.
If you're building a hull where you need to have sensors to tell you that it's failing, in the process of failing, you have no business designing subs or being in that sub. Let's call it poor choices. I don't want to say reckless, but let's say poor choices that were made.
We have to ask some real questions about the design and development of Titan and about what choices were made to bring us here and whether those choices were ethical and reasonable.
They call it delamination when water ingress starts to force the layers of the fibers apart, and theoretically you can hear it. I actually believe they heard it with their ears, not through the sensor system in the last moments of their lives, and that's quite a horrifying prospect. We all knew that the danger was delamination and progressive failure over time with microscopic water ingress and fatigue, what they call cycling fatigue. And we knew that if the sub passed its pressure test, it wasn't going to fail on the first dive. It might fail on dive 7, or I don't know what they're at, you know, but it's going to fail over time, which is insidious. You don't get that with steel or with titanium.
Over time, the water got where the flange was, because where the titanium meets the carbon fiber, those materials are moving at in different ways under those enormous pressures. 125 million pounds of pressure on that vessel at that depth.
At some point, safety is just pure waste. I mean, if you just want to be safe, don't get out of bed, don't get in your car, don't do anything.
I think that huge risks are required when innovating, especially in incredibly difficult environments like this. But we also have to think about the fact that there are passengers aboard. These are members of the public. I know that they're called mission specialists, but look, Some of them are, right? Nargeolet is certainly an expert, but we have a young man aboard this sub, a 19-year-old, and certainly a lot of the people who went aboard this sub were, I think, what you would call, members of the public.
There are obviously always risks in exploration. I think that's the nature of exploration. Kind of definitionally, you're going beyond. You're going beyond where people have gone before. You're going deeper. You're going farther out into space. Whatever it is, and it's our technology that allows us to project ourselves physically into these places, and that's very exciting to me.
I don't think you can begrudge, first of all, anybody who chooses to take a trip like this. I totally reject the criticism that people would go down to Titanic. I think that Titanic holds great meaning for many people, certainly people like P.H. Nargeolet on board. Titanic was his life. He's one of the world's foremost experts on this wreck. And so whether it's climbing Everest, whether it's base jumping, whether it's going down to Titanic, if something holds great personal meaning for you, I think you should be celebrated for doing it.
We've done deep submergence exploration all the way down to the deepest places in the ocean, the trenches, the abyssal plains, the hydrothermal vents, all over the world for 50 years without incident.
Look, it takes a lot of courage, a lot of determination and bravery to do something like that aboard any submersible. So I think the people aboard Titan should certainly be given a lot of admiration for their courage.
When I made the trip, I took a pad of paper and a pen, knowing the worst might happen. I might be stuck down there. I might die, marooned with 4 days of oxygen. I brought the pad and paper. I said, I'm going to write jokes. I'm going to go out writing jokes at the bottom of the ocean. And if they ever find him, people will go, wow, he died as he lived.
There are people who climb K2.
Right.
I'm not going to climb K2. That's not for me. But I wouldn't say that someone was crazy to do it, because whether it's mountaineering, whether it's deep sea exploration, whether it's, anything, if it holds great personal meaning to you, then it's something that's admirable for you to do.
And it was a company that was transporting people on the cheap, on what they thought of as a bus ride to a relatively safe place. Only 1/3 of the depth that I went to in my sub, where they got caught. And they got caught by poor engineering. It was a poor design. And I think we could see it was a poor design, but it was unfortunately a very graphic demonstration. And equally unfortunately, one of my friends was in the sub, P.H. Nargeolet, who was a legendary submersible pilot. But he wasn't an engineer. He didn't build the sub. He believed what they told him, I guess, and it wasn't right. So there are tourist subs that range anything from like 20-seat subs that'll go down a few hundred feet to 5 to 7 person subs that'll go down much deeper than that, to subs that'll go down to 1,000 meters, to 1,500 meters, to 2,000 meters. And it's got a perfect record. It's got a perfect record if the subs are classed, if they're certified. You can't put passengers into a sub without it fitting the certification rules, and they're quite stringent, as they should be. Now, these guys were circumventing that by calling them mission specialists and having them sort of carry a bucket and help turn a wrench or something so that it looked like they were doing something on the expedition, but it was a transparent workaround.
Stockton refused to pay any money to have the Titan correctly assessed and certified, and according to Lockridge, it was only designed to reach 1,300 meters or 4,300 feet, which is only 1/3 of the depth of the Titanic. Furthermore, he also revealed that the acrylic window was only rated to go that deep because OceanGate refused to fund the design of one that would go its intended depth of 4,000 meters or 13,000 feet.
So it's industry standard.
Right.
Test your vessel 20% deeper than what you plan to go.
Right.
I've done that. That's what they do with all classified subs in pressure chambers.
Right.
I see no evidence that he even ever did that.
His heart was in the right place, and he really was passionate about his project, and he believed everything he was saying. But one of the things that concerned me was he told me he was flying in to see me, and he was landing at North Las Vegas Airport, which is an odd selection. Most people that come in privately come into either McCarran, which is now Harry Reid International, or they come into Henderson Executive. And I asked him why, and he said he was coming in on a two-seater experimental plane that he built. And I started to think about, he's coming in on a 2-seater experimental plane to pitch me out to go on a 5-seater experimental sub that he built down to the ocean floor to see the Titanic. And he has a different risk appetite than I do. I'm a pilot, I have my helicopter pilot's license. I wouldn't get into an experimental aircraft.
When people go down to a place like Titanic as, let's call it a citizen explorer, right? I don't like tourists. I think somebody that's willing to spend that kind of money and do that kind of preparation and devote weeks of their life, they're a citizen explorer. They shouldn't have to worry about the vehicle that they're in. Worry about Titanic, because it's a dangerous site, you know, for entanglement and collapse. You could have a structural collapse on the sub. I think the second that you create a business model around asking people for $250,000 to take them to some place, you have to ensure their safety. You have to jump through every possible hoop. And you have to listen to the consensus in the engineering community. There is no excuse for what happened here, and I find it appalling and tragic. In the 21st century, there shouldn't be any risk. We've managed to make it through 60 years, from 1960 until today, 63 years, without a fatality.
He thought he knew better than everybody else.
Out here, this is really focused on one thing, and that's the pressure vessel, and making sure that component, which is clearly the most critical component of the sub, is safe and capable of handling depths down to 4,000 meters repeatedly with people on board.
Lockridge also insisted on having the hull scanned for safety measures before any dives were done, which Stockton refused and claimed that Lockridge wasn't an engineer and didn't know what he was talking about. At this point, Lockridge was actually fired and then sued for supposedly sharing trade secrets. He did actually countersue, and it would be resolved out of court months later.
I mean, it sounds like he spent more money suing his engineers to shut up than he did actually paying engineers to do testing.
In June that year, a test dive was done without a crew in Puget Sound, diving 4,000 meters, which went ahead without any incident. Stockton Rush not long after became only the second human after James Cameron to solo descend 13,000 feet deep.
The first dive Stockton did himself, and he heard the carbon fiber making cracking sounds, and he told us all before dive number 2 to be prepared for that.
He told us before the dive to expect loud noises that he had heard on his first dive, and we did. He described them as fireworks. I would say small caliber gunshots, same difference.
Get out of here.
That's how, I mean, the forces at those depths, according to the company's own website, the sub at Titanic depth was experiencing 127 million pounds of cumulative pressure on the hull. So, you know, anything that's being broken with that much force applied is going to make some noise.
In December 2018, Stockton Rush went on a solo dive, but once reaching 3,000 meters deep or 10,000 feet, he faced some unexpected positive buoyancy, which caused interference with the sub's communication system. He ended up losing contact with the support ship above for an entire hour and resorted to using vertical thrusters to resurface.
He had a lot of challenges, as people I think understand, with data communication through the water column. Partly because we don't behave like an AUV or where we send a standard data packet out and it's more horizontal range than vertical. We went straight through a thermocline and density difference. I was down about 3,000 meters all by myself, racing along, and you know these white particles are flying by of marine snow as I'm cruising through, and it was like something out of a Star Trek screen. And they're all alone and jamming this thing forward to get down to 4,000 meters as these what look like stars go flying by, and then every so often an invertebrate would go racing by. And that was, I think, the most amazing dive, to be down that deep alone, not talking to anybody, and it was the first time anybody had been in the sub down there. On the surface, they want to know every moment what's going on, and with the sub not being tethered, they don't get to see it, and so they're just dying to know what's happening on it. When you're in the sub, you could care less about them, and you don't want to waste any time talking to the surface. So this ability to have regular messages go up and give depth and location and power levels and things like that is really, really valuable. And one of the things that that is tough to overcome is the nature of the ocean being different.
In April the following year, a crew of 4 passengers actually went further by descending 3,760 meters deep, or 12,340 feet. However, it didn't exactly go smoothly. Carl Stanley was on board and could hear loud cracking noises during the dive. Upon returning to the surface, he raised this with Stockton, claiming that there were possible flaws or defects in the sub to the water pressure and it could be severely damaged and breaking down. He advised him that the damage will only get worse and it's only a matter of time until it's catastrophic. To which Rush replied and stated that more tests will take place.
He said, "What we heard, in my opinion, sounded like a flaw, a defect in one area being acted on by the tremendous pressures and being crushed or damaged. From the intensity of the sounds, the fact that they never totally stopped at depth, and the fact that there were sounds at about 300 feet that indicated a relaxing of stored energy would indicate that there is an area of the hull that is breaking down, getting spongy."
Imagine like a piece of wood breaking. If you do it very slowly and controllably, you're going to hear a lot of cracking before the beam just completely breaks.
It made noise for most of the trip, obviously the most towards the end of, or when we were the deepest. And the more troubling aspect was it even made noise all the way up to 300 feet from the surface on the way back up, which means there was stored energy in there which was releasing, the hull was getting mashed up. So, and that was only on the second dive.
At one point, I was actually even able to drive the submarine towards deeper water by the sound of the cracking getting louder. And somewhere I have video of it, actually.
I told him he didn't have a marketable product. I remember that was one sticking point. Like, he wanted to continue with diving.
Right.
And just monitoring the sounds and, tell his customers what to expect, and he thought that he was going to be able to be fine. Even after hearing all that noise, he seemed pretty sure of himself that he wanted to dive that year.
By January 2020, they estimated that manufacturing these alone would cost around $18.1 million. More tests were done as the hull was beginning to show signs of cyclic fatigue, and the sub itself was derated to only being suitable for dives to 3,000 meters deep, or 9,800 feet. The hull was then either repaired or replaced entirely, it's unclear which, before they began their first trips to the wreck of the Titanic, despite this being 3,800 meters deep, or 12,500 feet.
Obviously, there was not that much demand of people willing to spend $250,000 to see the Titanic if he was trying to give away trips, flying to try to woo clients and offering them discounts. He needed money. That much is obvious at this point. He was very driven, and I think another part, I'm no psychologist, but to do a little junior napkin analysis here, he was from a very prominent family. I think he felt that he needed to leave a mark on the world, and he was driven by ego, and he was in a tight spot financially, probably also exacerbated by the pandemic.
In order to reassure their customers that this submersible was entirely safe, Stockton claimed that he had actually purchased the carbon fiber materials from Boeing, but did admit that they were discounted because they were past their shelf life. However, Boeing put out a statement to say that they have no records of any exchange taking place between themselves and Stockton Rush or OceanGate. They also claimed to have worked alongside NASA and the University of Washington. The latter stated that they had absolutely no involvement in the design, engineering, or testing. And while NASA admitted their Marshall Space Flight Center did have a Space Act agreement with OceanGate, they denied ever conducting testing with them, nor did they help manufacture the sub.
He also highlighted the fact that Rush was buying products off the shelves of stores like Home Depot and Amazon to use in the submersible. And McCollum says he was alarmed about the culture at OceanGate. He says anytime anyone raised a safety concern there, that Rush would take it as a personal affront.
They cut corners. They used unproven experimental technology on a sub that took passengers. And to me, that's inexcusable. And they were uncertified. And they knew that the certification process would not approve the technologies that they adopted.
I had nothing to do with OceanGate, and I never tried to warn Stockton Rush of the same thing, because I thought maybe they've solved it,
There is no metric in the world that he could use to make it sound reasonable that he had hit certain benchmarks to be ready to take that operation with that many moving parts to the middle of the North Atlantic.
The crew would leave St. John's in Newfoundland and would spend 2 days sailing south to reach the dive site above the Titanic. But many times these planned dives were called off due to either weather conditions or most usually technical malfunctions. Originally, tickets for these dives would cost $105,129, as this was the price of the Vanderbilt suite on board the Titanic when adjusted for inflation. But these prices were now raised to $250,000 each, with no refunds. If a dive was cancelled due to technical malfunctions, then the guest would actually be given a free spot in the next dive the next summer. However, if it was cancelled due to weather conditions, they would be given another spot, but half price. The crew would often involve Stockton Rush, a tour expert, and then 3 passengers. They would spend 5 days in the ocean above the wreckage, and 2 test dives would usually be attempted before the final one, though very often these would be cancelled due to weather conditions or technical difficulties. It would take around 2 hours to reach the wreck of the Titanic, and the full excursion itself about 8 hours to complete. Furthermore, every 15 minutes the submersible would send a safety ping to the ship above, just to keep them updated on their well-being. 54 people actually signed up to take part, but due to issues with the relevant permits, plans were delayed until 2020. As the Titan was operating in international waters and didn't carry passengers from a port, it wasn't subject to safety regulations. It wasn't certified as being seaworthy by any regulatory agency. Both David Pogue and Mike Reese confirmed that every passenger had to sign a waiver confirming their knowledge that this submersible was an experimental vessel that hadn't been approved or certified, and that this trip could result in physical injury, disability, emotional trauma, or death. In fact, this waiver mentioned death 3 times just on the first page.
On one hand, he was trying to say, you know, this is safe, that I'm not risking safety, but on the other hand, the waiver that he was having you sign, the wording couldn't have been any harsher. And he also, you know, for all his not doing enough testing and planning and thinking ahead, he sure seems to have thought ahead about his waiver. It very specifically says that any disputes go to the Bahamas. So I mean, it looks like he went above and beyond when it came to covering his own ass in the event that he died. But he didn't go above and beyond for his customer's safety.
The threat of death is constantly hanging over you. People have focused on the waiver you sign before you even get on the boat that's taking you to where the sub is going to drop you. And the waiver is really 100 ways to die. Stockton Rush had thought of every single way this trip could kill you. It's not like you needed to be told that. Everyone knew, you know, this was not Disneyland. This was not a roller coaster. It was scary, and it was not a sure thing.
It is described in those waivers as an experimental craft, and I think that it is truly experimental in a very real sense of the word. This is not like boarding a commercial flight on a new airplane. This is like being a test pilot on a plane that has never flown before.
I was very vocal even to the people involved in that, saying somebody's going to get killed in a wound filament composite hull.
For the next 2 years, Titan was tested with its maximum intended depth of 4,000 meters without incident. But then plans for Cyclops 3 and 4 began, hoping to go even further into the ocean, reaching 6,000 meters or 20,000 feet. Between 2021 and 2022, the Titan actually did have some successful dives to the wreck of the Titanic. But that doesn't mean that there weren't some problems along the way. In 2021, some more shallow test dives were done in Washington before, in the spring, Stockton took 1 single passenger down on a test with himself, which all went smoothly without incident. In May, TV host Josh Gates and his camera operator Brian Weed did another dive in the Puget Sound, but they only managed to reach 30 meters deep before having to abandon the dive due to technical difficulties. Not only did they lose all communications, but they had issues with their propulsion system, and the computers on board also began to malfunction. Rush attempted to reboot the sub using the touchscreen feature, but this also failed. And due to this, Josh and his cameraman refused to take part in the dive to the Titanic.
I had a lot of really interesting experiences with Stockton. It was a thrilling experience. Titan was a really novel vehicle, but by the end of the trip, I really just came to the conclusion that this wasn't for me. And I'm not a guy who says no to dangerous things very easily. At the end of the day, the problem with Titan for me was that there is really nothing to benchmark it against. This is a vehicle that is a one-off. There is nothing else that has ever been built like Titan to go down to Titanic. It is unlike any other sub. I really felt more than anything that it was nearly impossible to measure the risk of Titan as a platform. It was just almost impossible to measure it against anything else. It is such a unique vehicle. For me, it represented frankly just too much risk, and it just wasn't for me in the end. I would say that some of the systems on board performed very well, some of them didn't perform well at all. We had issues with thrusters, we had issues with computer control aboard, but of course this was a test designed to kind of get Titan up and running for the voyages it was going to make a few months later. Those kind of things aren't uncommon on a test dive. Having said that, ultimately, I decided to back off of our project because I just couldn't get comfortable ultimately with the design of Titan because there was so little data available about managing that risk and really what it looked like if this sub went up and down as many times as it was going to.
On one dive, the Titan suffered mechanical problems and remained stuck at the bottom of the ocean for 4 hours. They were unable to ascend and couldn't even find the wreck either. Passengers on board ended up being inside for 20 hours before finally reascending to the surface. But surprisingly, those on board the Titan still recommended the experience. Mike Reese was on board for 4 dives with OceanGate, and he claimed that the Titan actually lost contact with the support ship on every single one of which took 3 hours to locate the wreck of the Titanic, despite only landing 460 meters or 500 yards away.
It was smooth sailing to the point where I got on the submarine and it just drops for 2.5 hours. It takes 2.5 hours to go 2.5 miles down, and I fell asleep. I mean, if you want to hear a man not panicky, I had a beautiful nap on the submarine, and it's a very shocking experience to wake up from a nap and think you're in bed, and no, you're in a tube 2 miles down under the ocean. I woke up when we touched bottom, and then we had to spend the next 2.5 hours just sailing around the ocean floor looking for the Titanic. We knew it was there. We knew it was 500 yards away, but it was complete darkness, and we had no real guide. And so we just sailed for hours, and at any moment, you only get 3 hours on the bottom of the ocean, and it's nothing to do with oxygen or supplies. They just have to get you back to the surface while there's still daylight. 2.5 hours in, they're about to just wrap the whole mission, and we wouldn't have seen the Titanic. And we really just stumbled on it. It popped into view, and we literally only had enough time for the Instagram experience. It's not what we all went for. These are not tourists who are doing this. These are explorers and people who were curious about the world. So I didn't get the full experience. I got the photos.
There were communication problems on every trip I've taken. Of the 4 separate dives I'd taken with OceanGate, every time there was a problem with at least, sporadically communicating with the surface. And again, I don't think that's their fault as much as just that's the nature of the beast. When you're going 1,000 feet or 13,000 feet underwater, you're going to lose contact for a while.
It is complete blackness. And, they keep the sub itself very dimly lit. It's really almost a spa experience. You're just laying on the floor. There's no furniture. And you're in this state. You're scared, but you're also very relaxed and you're excited. It's amazing. You hold these 3 emotions at once. There were always communication issues. You would lose contact sporadically, and it's nothing I blame the sub for. I blame deep water for it. It just seems to go with the territory. That communication would go in and out. And then there was also, literal communication was a problem where when we were looking for the Titanic, we were getting all this advice from the surface going, turn left at this rock. And we would go, there is no rock. They kept feeding us information that didn't correspond to where we were exactly.
In 2022, there were 5 successful dives to the wreckage, one of which was on July the 2nd, where actor Ellen Estrada was on board and even vlogged the experience for YouTube, spending 4 hours exploring the legendary ship.
Yo, honestamente, como participante de estas expediciones, sabía perfectamente los riesgos a los que nos involucrábamos. Firmamos un release de varias hojas, no recuerdo cuántas. Sabemos que no estamos yendo a un parque de diversiones. Lo que nos pasó a nosotros es que si pierdes comunicación, hay un lapso de tiempo de tolerancia en el cual si esa comunicación no se recupera, sí o sí hay que abortar la misión.
No.
Pasó el tiempo de tolerancia y estábamos ya abortando la misión. De hecho, arrojamos el primero de los lastres y justo en ese momento recuperamos comunicación y ya no la perdimos, y fue por eso que pudimos hacer el descenso.
Between July the 9th to the 17th in 2022, reporter David Pogue and some CBS News crew members were on an excursion down to the Titanic, but the first one was cancelled. On another attempt, they were unable to even find the wreck at all due to technical difficulties. David claimed that the sub didn't have an emergency locator beacon on board, which meant the support ship above completely lost track of it for 5 solid hours.
They could still send short texts to the sub, but did not know where it was. It was quiet and very tense, and they shut off the ship's internet to prevent us from tweeting.
There aren't very many things that can go wrong that you can do anything about, right? So fire is something they addressed extensively. They showed us where the fire extinguisher was. They have a smoke mask for each passenger. We had to practice putting those on. But beyond that, what can you do if the sub gets trapped, if the sub develops a leak, if the sub goes without power? All of the things that can happen beyond that, the answer is the same thing: get to the surface. And they had so many different ways of getting to the surface. They can drop sandbags, they can drop lead pipes, they can drop the legs off the bottom. They have an air balloon that pulls up. They can use their thrusters. And as you mentioned, one of these 7 different methods is a dead man's switch. That is, it will send you to the surface even if everyone on board has passed out. It's a time-release sandbag system that slowly dissolves the connectors underneath the sub and lets them drop off after a certain number of hours. And you go to the surface even if you're not awake.
On another occasion, one of the thrusters on the sub was actually installed backwards, which meant that the Titan just kept spinning around in circles, trying desperately to move forward against the sea floor. And they were only able to override this by tilting the game controller sideways.
Am I spinning?
Yes.
I am?
Yes.
Looks like it.
Now you're going north.
When I'm thrusting forward, one of the thrusters is thrusting backwards right now. So the only thing I can do right now is a 360.
I was thinking, we're not going to make it. We're literally 300 meters from Titanic, and although we're in the debris field, we can't go anywhere but go in circles.
On another dive that same year, the Submersible suffered battery issues and had to be manually attached to a lifting platform to ascend, which ended up damaging external components. British actor and TV presenter Ross Kemp even wanted to celebrate the 110th anniversary of the sinking by visiting the wreck on the Titan for a documentary, but the production company Atlantic Productions deemed it unsafe and the project was shelved.
At any one time, there are different documentaries that one could be making, and that is true. I was invited, and we had dialogue with the company in order for me to go down actually this summer. But it was decided by other people, not me, that it wasn't the right thing to do. But
Did you want to do it?
Of course I was going to do it.
Yeah.
I love diving. I'm an HSC qualified diver, and I'm fascinated by the sea, and I'm fascinated by wrecks. However, right now, all you care about are the families. It wasn't my decision. I'm not. I'm not expert enough to know whether that was the right sub or not.
In early 2023, Stockton Rush approached Las Vegas businessman Jay Bloom, offering him 2 discounted tickets on board the Titan sub for a trip to the wreck of the Titanic for $150,000 each, claiming that it was safer than crossing the street. However, Bloom turned it down due to safety concerns.
It's a very surreal experience in the beginning. You know you're supposed to be on that. We had the opportunity to be on that sub, and you see all this. It's everywhere we looked. And the most haunting thing about it is when you look at the news and open my laptop, on social media, on television. It was everywhere, and they'd show pictures of the people who lost their lives, and all I could see when I saw that father and son was myself and my son. That could have been us. I think he had so much passion for the project that he was blinded by it. He wasn't objective, and he didn't look at things that I saw and that others saw that were problematic because it just didn't fit his narrative.
Stockton Rush asked me if I wanted to go out there and dive this season. I wasn't interested.
And allegedly, popular YouTuber Mr. Beast was also invited for a trip, but he too declined.
I've learned a lot more what kind of financial pressure he was under. The fact that he was giving away seats to YouTubers.
Mr. Beast,
he offered and he turned them down.
That was recently. Mr. Beast could have been on that boat.
And there was a next couple with YouTube channels that...
Kate and Nate, was it Kate and Nate?
I don't know, but they were out there and they got in the sub, but I guess something malfunctioned and they didn't get to go all the way down. He was almost proud of the fact that he went out there and did less than half the number of dives that he had promised people he was going to do, because it showed that he was trying and willing to innovate. It's like, you got a bunch of disappointed people.
The dive was scheduled for May 2023, but due to poor weather conditions, it was postponed until June. On June the 16th, 2023, the crew left Newfoundland and arrived at the site 2 days later.
Due to the worst winter in Newfoundland in 40 years, this mission is likely to be the first and only crewed mission to the Titanic in 2023. A weather window has just opened up and we are going to attempt to dive tomorrow.
On board the Titan was 61-year-old Stockton Rush, 58-year-old Hamish Harding, 48-year-old Shahzada Dawood and his 19-year-old son Sulman, and 77-year-old Titanic expert Paul Henry Nargeolet. Shahzada Dawood was a Pakistani-British businessman of the Dawood Hercules Corporation, as well as a philanthropist, while his son Sulman was a student at the University of Strathclyde. Sadly, Sulman wasn't even supposed to be on this trip. His mother Christine was, but she gave up her ticket for him to take her place instead.
So it was supposed to be Shahzada and I going down, but then I stepped back and gave the space to Suleiman because he really wanted to go. We just hugged and joked actually, because Shahzada was so excited to go down. He was like a little child. I missed him. And I really, really missed him.
Hamish Harding was a British businessman, aviator and space tourist who had previously broken the Guinness World Record for the fastest circumnavigation of the Earth, and he had even flown into space the previous year. Paul Henry Nargeolet was a former French Navy commander, diver, submersible pilot, member of the French Institute for Research and Exploitation of the Sea, and director of underwater research for the RMS Titanic Inc. He had led over 35 expeditions to the site and was widely considered to have been the leading authority on the Titanic wreck.
I think it means a lot that he spent his final moments, near a scene in the world that meant so much to him.
I think there's a great, almost surreal irony here, which is Titanic sank because the captain took it full steam into an ice field at night on a moonless night with very poor visibility. After he had been repeatedly warned by telegram, by Marconigram, by radio, during the day, that's what was ahead of him. And so I think we're also seeing a parallel here with unheeded warnings about a sub that was not certified.
So many people commenting, why would you do this? Why would you put your life at risk to go down there? And I have to say that, look, Titanic has fascinated the world since the night that she sank. And It holds a deep personal meaning for many people. Shipwrecks in general, as someone who's visited many shipwrecks in my career, shipwrecks are time capsules. They connect us to the past in a really intimate way.
To me, the big irony is that the Titanic sank because of bad seamanship. The captain was warned, and he took a decision to go full speed into a known ice field that he had Marconigram, telegrams in his pocket. Warning about the ice ahead, and on a moonless night where they couldn't see anything, they just steamed full speed ahead. And I kind of feel that that's what happened here. I feel that this was such a preventable tragedy. We've never had a tragedy like this in the entire history of deep submergence.
It was the first submersible to implode in the history of humanity.
But after all these years, it seems like all of these warnings were certainly well-founded. On June the 18th, 2023, at 9:30 a.m., the Titan submersible began its dive in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. For the first 2 hours or so, everything seemed to be going smoothly, communicating with the support ship Polar Prince every 15 minutes. But strangely, all communication stopped at 11:15. But despite this, due to all of the technical difficulties in the past, no immediate cause of concern was raised, as they weren't due to return to the surface until 4:30 that afternoon. However, that time came and gone, and there were still no signs of the Titan. But it wasn't until 7:10 p.m, hours later, that they were officially declared missing. It was now when the US Navy reported that their acoustic detection did pick up an acoustic signature from below the water. Remaining optimistic, many believed this could have been the crew trying to call for help from below, and that they were actually still alive. With only 96 hours of oxygen remaining, this led to a frantic and desperate search party.
The search was a sham. The way that the boat communicates with the sub is through sound waves. And while 13,000 feet underwater sounds like a great distance, whales can talk to each other 1,000 miles away. And submarines can hear things 1,000 miles away. I can hear boats passing when I'm 2,000 feet underwater. I hear the propellers of the boats going. I've heard it raining when I'm 1,000 feet underwater. That's just with my ear, not with something in the water listening to them. When they were listening, they heard that. There's no way they didn't hear that. That was 127 million pounds of kinetic energy being released at the speed of sound.
Oh, we're talking about 7,000. How deep they were?
Around 12,000 feet.
Okay.
But that's really not that, They might have even felt a shockwave on the boat.
Monday morning, when I first found out about the incident, got on a whole bunch of calls and emails. It's a small community. Within an hour and a half, I had the following information. They were on descent. They were at 3,500 feet. They lost comms and tracking. The last one being the critical one, because the transponder that's used to track a sub during descent and on the bottom is a fully autonomous system. It's in its own pressure housing, and it has its own battery power. So for them to lose comms and tracking at the same time, sub was gone. There was no question in my mind. For days, I tried to run other scenarios that could account for it. I could come up with nothing.
My immediate thought when I heard that they lost comms and tracking, any submarine has backup power for those things, and there's no other I asked a lot of experts, give me another explanation why they lose tracking and comms and would not surface except implosion.
We got confirmation within an hour that there had been a loud bang at the same time that that comms were lost. A loud bang on the hydrophones, loss of transducer or transponder, loss of comms. I knew what happened. Sub imploded. I sent emails to everybody I know. I said, we've lost some friends. The sub has imploded. It's on the bottom in pieces right now. I sent that out Monday morning. I couldn't think of any other scenario in which a sub would be lost where it lost comms and navigation at the same time and stayed out of touch and did not surface.
I came up with one idea 2 days later, actually while I was 2,000 feet underwater. that possibly if they had been aiming directly for the ship and landed directly into it, they could have been trapped in the ship, and the ship itself could have been blocking their sound waves from their transducer.
I guess a lot of people have said, do they go into the Titanic? Would they be trapped in the stateroom or on the stairway? No, you don't go in it. You just go around it and on top of it. You know, beyond the Titanic, there was really nothing down there. It's 2.5 miles down, and there's not seaweed, there's not coral, there's not fish, there's nothing there.
It's tough to speculate about this. I think in some ways there are only a handful of things, categories of things that could go wrong. One of the real challenges here is communication. It's very hard to communicate with untethered subs like this from the surface anyway. But the fact that Titan lost communication on its way down to Titanic, and that they have not received communication since then, would indicate that something went wrong with its systems. Now, it was well off the bottom when that communication was lost, and so using those multiple redundancies of weight drop systems, Titan should have returned to the surface, right? And so the fact that that hasn't happened opens up this whole other question of what are these other possibilities?
The really nightmarish scenario is that they are alive at the surface, bobbing away, running out of air, and unable to get out.
I didn't really think the pressure hull was going to fail and implode like that, but I mean, ultimately I thought he was, going to make a fool of himself and disappoint a lot of people, and he was making promises he couldn't keep.
The only scenario that I could come up with in my mind that could account for that was an implosion, a shockwave event so powerful that it actually took out a secondary system that has its own pressure vessel and its own battery power supply, which is the transponder that the ship uses to track where the sub is.
My analogy is think of an egg. Grab an egg, crush it. That's essentially what happened.
I think we're still in the time period here, though this time period is closing, where I think we should remain hopeful. We've got 5 people aboard this sub. We have a young man aboard this sub, and all of these new assets are now rushing out to the North Atlantic to aid in this search. And so I think that we should remain hopeful here for a positive outcome for this, which is what everybody here wants, obviously. We're going to know more about that, I think, in the next day or so here.
If they're down there, if they're alive, if they're even in a no-win situation, I'm sure there's just calm. There's utter calm to it, because that's how I felt during the whole mission. You're in this special kind of state, in a special place. And again, they're so lucky that they're there with Stockton, who's as in control and as in focus as anyone I've ever met.
My belief is that if it is in the water, underwater, I don't understand how it's even conceivable. There are only a handful of submersibles in the world that can go to those depths, and none of them are ready to get there within the next 24 hours. And even if they could, first they have to find it, which is unbelievably difficult on the sea floor where there's no light. Secondly, what would you do if you did find it? These are submersibles. These are not submarines. These are low-powered things that need a ship to carry them from place to place. They could not tow the thing up to the surface. So suppose they find it on the seafloor in 5 minutes, then what? I just don't understand what technology could get them back up.
Then I watched over the ensuing days this whole sort of everybody running around with their hair on fire search, knowing full well that it was futile, hoping against hope that I was wrong, but knowing in my bones that I wasn't.
I just sit here listening to this news and remember my time in Titan, remember going down. I spent probably 2 or 3 hours in the sub with Stockton, taking it through its paces, and I think like everybody, I just prayed right up until that conference for a miracle, for a positive outcome to all this.
Even the most prepared person in the world could not do anything in this situation if A, the sub imploded, B, it got snagged on something underneath, or C, it's currently floating somewhere on the surface with the power gone and they can't reach anybody. Those are, as I see it, those are the only 3 possibilities right now.
Certainly one of those possibilities is a hull failure. That kind of speaks to the carbon fiber design of Titan, and also a concern in all submersibles. electrical fires, computer failure, things like that.
They were on descent, they were a couple hundred meters above the seafloor, and they dropped their weights. Now, the only way for the ship to know that they had dropped their ascent weights, which would be an emergency abort, is if they had called that in, that they were ascending. So I believe now that they had some warning, that they heard some acoustic signature of the hull beginning to delaminate. An investigation will hopefully eventually show what did happen, because we all need to know as we go forward. The deep submergence community needs to know exactly what happened.
But I think they were all in a state of shock, and I think the number 2 in the company was Stockton's now widow, and I don't think she had herself in the right frame of mind to declare herself a widow.
Implosion is obviously the specter that looms over us all the time, but because of that, that's the thing that you engineer for the most years in advance. So that should never be the problem. I've never believed that if I was, going to have a serious problem in a sub, that it would be implosion. Maybe entanglement in a fishing net, maybe a fire from the electronics. Hard to rule those things out. Implosion, absolutely not. Especially with modern finite element analysis and computer-aided design.
If these guys get back safely, yes, I would do it again. If they don't, then no, I think I just won't do it, because, fool me once, shame on you. And, I think if I went after a disaster and did it again, I think nobody would really feel sorry for me.
Then they let this thing turn into a big search and rescue, and Hope is alive, but they knew.
The United States Coast Guard, the US Navy, and the Canadian Coast Guard all joined the search efforts, using aircrafts from the Royal Canadian Air Force, Royal Canadian Navy ships, and several other commercial or research ships using underwater sonar for any kind of evidence of the sub. They searched around 900 miles, but due to the remote location, difficult weather conditions, darkness and treacherous sea conditions and water temperature, it was practically like looking for a needle in a haystack.
I've been in the marine industry since a very young age and seen a lot of different situations, and I've never seen equipment of that nature move that quickly. The response from the US Coast Guard, the US military, folks at the airport, the people here, various companies who were involved in the mobilization of that equipment, it was done flawlessly.
However, this search did cause controversy, as off the coast of Greece, a fishing boat carrying somewhere between 400 to 750 migrants sank, killing nearly 100 people, with hundreds more missing, and they didn't receive nearly as much support in the search and rescue as the Titan. Many submersibles had an acoustic beacon that could emit sounds to be heard from above for potential rescuers to hear them through the water. But much like its other technical manufacturing deficiencies, the Titan didn't have one. By June the 20th, 2 days since the dive and with only 2 days of oxygen remaining, 10,000 square miles had been searched, including the seabed. It was strictly treated as a rescue mission and not a wreckage recovery mission. But sadly, if they were still alive, they would have run out of oxygen on the morning of June the 22nd. But that time came and went, and there was still no signs until the afternoon. At 1:18 p.m, a debris field was found near the wreck of the Titanic, and sadly it was soon confirmed to have been belonging to the Titan sub. Upon evaluation, the acoustic sounds previously picked up were consistent of a submersible implosion, and by 4:30 it was confirmed that this is what had happened around 1,600 feet northeast of the bow of the Titanic.
The Coast Guard says the 22-foot Titan broke into fields of debris, including its nose cone and both ends of the pressure hull, made of carbon fiber and titanium. The hull likely imploded under what Marquet says is water pressure amounting to the weight of the Empire State Building. Did carbon fiber present a risk?
We don't have a lot of experience. What happens when it gets frozen and compressed and then warmed and relaxed?
Certainly wasn't a surprise today, and I just feel terrible for the families that had to go through all these false hopes that kept getting dangled, as it played out.
It just breaks my heart for their families. It's just very unbelievable. It's so surreal.
Now there's one wreck lying next to the other wreck for the same damn reason. Here we have at the wreck of Titanic, we now have another wreck that is based on, unfortunately, the same principles of not heeding warnings.
My heart is absolutely broken, like everybody else. I knew Stockton Rush, as I said. Also knew Hamish Harding aboard the sub, who's a fellow member of the Explorers Club. So it's just an incredible loss.
I can't imagine what these poor families have been through over the last 4 days, being given false hope here, banging noises, da-da-da, this and that. And, it must have been just, horrible for them. And I feel so bad.
The titanium covers from both ends of the sub were found to have been completely intact, suggesting that the carbon fiber most likely had failed, as no large pieces were recovered, and some presumed human remains were also discovered inside the debris as well. But it's unclear whether the crew truly knew what dangers they were in, if this was instantaneous, or if they knew milliseconds before their death that they were about to die. James Cameron believed that the sub's early warning system may have alerted them of impending delamination of the hull, and that they dropped their ascend weights and were trying their best to evacuate, realizing the emergency. He also blamed himself for not speaking out more against it before their inevitable demise. In the months that followed, text messages were leaked, supposedly between the Titan sub and the support ship the Polar Prince. But it remains unclear whether these genuinely are the final messages received from the Titan or not. OceanGate have not spoken out to confirm or deny. Hello guys, this is Rob from Seeking Answers. I really hope you enjoyed that episode. If you do want to see more, please consider donating to Patreon or clicking that join button below to become a channel member. Unfortunately, YouTube's monetization doesn't really cater to the content that we make, so we do need all the help that we can get. I also realised that not everyone is able to give a monthly payment, so there is now a PayPal link in the description if anyone does want to donate a one-off payment. Doesn't matter the amount, any amount is appreciated. And if you do a one-off payment, you'll be able to request a case for us to cover, and it will really go towards helping the channel out and continuing to grow the community. Any amount is appreciated and it will go towards keeping this channel alive and making more content, going on location more. You will get perks in exchange and you will help really give this channel the boost it needs. Thank you for all of your support and tune in next week for another video.